Madam President,
Democratic leader.
are we in a quorum?
We are.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Madam President, this is a serious, solemn, and historic day. The events that will take place this afternoon have happened only twice before in our grand nation's 250-year history. The Chief Justice will swear in every U.S. Senator to participate as a court of impeachment in a trial of the President of the United States. Yesterday, the Senate received notice that the House of Representatives has two articles of impeachment to present. The House managers will exhibit those two articles today at noon. The first article charges the President with abuse of power, coercing a foreign leader into interfering in our elections, thereby using the powers of the presidency, the most powerful public office in the nation, to benefit himself rather than the public interest. The second charges the President with obstruction of Congress for an unprecedented blockade of the legislature's ability to investigate those very matters. Let me just talk about each one. The first is so serious. Some of our Republican colleagues have said, some of the President's own men have said, yeah, he did it, but it doesn't matter. It's not impeachable. Some of them even fail to say, many of my Republican colleagues amazingly fail to say it's wrong. Let me ask the American people, do we want foreign leaders helping determine who's our president, our senators, our congressmen, our governors, our legislators? That's what President Trump's argument will be, that it's okay to do that there's nothing wrong with it, that it is perfect. Hardly anything is more serious than powers outside the borders of the United States determining, influencing elections inside the United States. And it's bad enough to do it, but even worse, to blackmail a country of aid that was legally allocated to get them to do it. It is low. It is not what America has been all about. The second charge as well. The President says he wants the truth, but he blocks every attempt to get the facts. All the witnesses that we're asking for, he could have allowed them to testify in the House. They wanted them. The President is blocking them. And again, the American people, just about all of them, are asking the question, what is the President hiding? What is he afraid of? If he did nothing wrong, why didn't he let the witnesses, the documents, come forward in the House of Representatives? Put another way, the House of Representatives has accused the President of trying to shake down a foreign leader for personal gain, deliberately soliciting foreign interference in our elections, something the Founding Fathers greatly feared, and then doing everything he could to cover it up. The gravity of these charges is self-evident to anyone who is not self-interested. If proved, they are not petty crimes or politics as usual, but a deep, wounding injury to democracy itself, precisely the conduct most feared by the founders of our institution, of our Constitution. So we, as senators, Democrats and Republicans, must rise to the occasion, realizing the seriousness of the charges and the solemnity of an impeachment proceeding. The beginning of the impeachment trial today will be largely ceremonial, but soon our duty will be constitutional. The constitutional duty is to conduct a fair trial, and then, as our oaths this afternoon command, senators must, quote, do impartial justice, unquote. Senators must, quote, do impartial justice. The weight of that oath will fall on our shoulders. Our ability to honor it will be preserved in history. Now, yesterday evening, I was gratified to hear the Republican leader, at least in part of his speech, ask the Senate to rise to the occasion. I was glad to hear him say so. For somebody who has been partisan, deeply, strongly, and almost unrelentingly partisan for 2 months, he said something that could bring us together. The Senate should rise to the occasion. But far more important than saying it is doing it. What does doing it mean? The best way for the Senate to rise to the occasion would be to retire partisan considerations and to have everyone agree on the parameters of a fair trial. The best way for the Senate to rise to the occasion would be for Democrats and Republicans to agree on relevant witnesses and relevant documents, not run the trial with votes of a slim majority, not jam procedures through, not define rising to the occasion as doing things my way, which is what the majority leader has done thus far, but rather a real and honest and bipartisan agreement on a point we all know must be confronted, that we must have witnesses, documents in order to have a fair trial. A trial without witnesses is not a trial. A trial without documents is not a trial. That is why every completed impeachment trial in our nation's history, every single one that has gone to completion, 15, have included witnesses. The majority leader claims to believe in precedent. That is the precedent, witnesses. There is no deviation. Let us hope we don't have one this time. Over the centuries, senators have stood where we stand today, confronted with the responsibility of judging the removal of the president. They rightly concluded they were obligated to seek the truth. They were under a solemn obligation to hear the facts before rendering a final judgment. The leader, incorrectly in my judgment, but the leader complained that the House was doing short-termism and rush. The leader is trying to do the exact same thing in the Senate. The very things he condemns the House Democrats for, he seems bent on doing. Condemning short-termism? Are we going to have a full trial? Condemning the rush? Are we going to allow the time for witnesses and documents? Or is the leader going to try to rush it through? At the very same time, out of the other side of his mouth, he condemns the House, incorrectly in my judgment, for doing it. And another thing about the importance of witnesses and documents. The leader has still not given a good argument about why we shouldn't have witnesses and documents. He complains about process and pens and signing ceremonies, but still does not address the charges against the president and why we shouldn't have witnesses and documents. We're waiting. Rise to the occasion. Remember the history. That is what the leader said he would do last night, and I was glad to hear it. But he must act, not talk about rising to the occasion, and then doing the very same things he condemns the House for. If my colleagues had any doubts about the case for witnesses and documents in a Senate trial, the stunning revelations this week should put those to rest. We have new information about a plot by the president's attorney and his associates to oust an American ambassador, and potentially with the, quote, knowledge and consent, unquote, of the president, pressure Ukrainian President Zelensky to announce an investigation of one of the president's political rivals. The effort to remove Ambassador Yovanovitch by Lev Parnas and Mr. Giuliani is now the subject of an official probe by the government of Ukraine. My friends, this information is not extraneous. It's central to the charges against the president. We have a responsibility to call witnesses and subpoena documents that will shed light on the truth here. God forbid we rush through this trial and only afterward the truth comes out. How will my colleagues on the other side of the aisle feel if they rushed it through and then even more evidence comes out? We've seen lots come out. There's barely been a week where significant new evidence further making the House case hasn't come out as strong as the House case was to begin with. Here's what Alexander Hamilton warned of in Federalist 65. He said, "The greatest danger is that a decision in an impeachment trial will be regulated more by the comparative strength of the parties than by the real demonstration of innocence or guilt." Alexander Hamilton, even before the day political parties were as strong as they are today, wanted us to come together. The leader wants to do things on his own without any democratic input. But fortunately, we have the right to demand votes and to work hard as we can for a fair trial, a full trial, a trial with witnesses, a trial with documents. The founders anticipated that impeachment trials would always be buffeted by the wind of politics, but they gave the power to the Senate anyway because they believed the chamber was the only place where impartial justice of the president could truly be sought. In the coming days, these eventful and important coming days, each of us will face a choice about whether to begin this trial in a search of the truth or in the service of the president's desire to cover up and rush things through. The Senate can either rise to the occasion or demonstrate that the faith of our founders was misplaced in what they considered a grand institution. As each of us swear an oath this afternoon, let every senator reflect on these questions. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Illinois.
Madam President, I come to the floor of the Senate today at a moment that will be remembered in history. In just a few hours, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court will come to this chamber, will be sworn in as the presiding officer in the impeachment trial of President Donald John Trump. He will then administer an oath to each member of the United States Senate. It's an oath that's included in our Senate manual. It's very brief, only 35 words, and it bears repeating for the record at this moment. Each senator will be asked to make the following oath and affirmation. I quote, "I solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, now pending, I will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help me God." In just 35 words, that oath binds all of us, Republicans and Democrats, who swear by that oath to do impartial justice. The Founding Fathers and others could have been much more elaborate in describing the process that we face. But in its simplicity, this oath really tells us what we will face in the coming days. I believe more than ever, starting on Tuesday, when the impeachment trial begins in earnest on the floor of the Senate, America will be watching. Many Americans have busy lives, personal, private, family, and professional, and don't tune in to the political events of the moment as many of us do. But I think more and more of them will be watching come Tuesday. They are going to see an historic moment, only the third time in history, when a president of the United States faces impeachment. What will they find? Will they find an effort to do impartial justice? Will they find partisanship? Will they find a real trial? I think it's important for us to realize that a real trial includes evidence. As a lawyer, I brought many cases to trial, a few of them to verdict, and I had to prepare my case, not just my theory of the law or a statement of facts, but proof, real proof, proof that came from documents and witnesses. That's what a real trial is about. Unfortunately, on the other side, the majority leader has suggested that we don't need witnesses, and that it's only evidence of the weakness of the impeachment charges. I think he's wrong. As the Democratic leader said this morning, history will prove him wrong, because in impeachment trial after impeachment trial, evidence and witnesses have been presented. That is the tradition and the precedent of the United States Senate. If there's an effort to short-circuit that, to eliminate the witnesses and the evidence, I think it'll be obvious to the American people who are following this what is underway. In this morning's newspaper, it was reported that the President's defense team has been ready, anxious, if you will, for this impeachment trial to begin, and equally anxious to end it as quickly as possible. I hope they don't prevail in that sentiment, because a race to judgment may not serve the cause of impartial justice. We believe that the House managers should be allowed to make their presentation, and they will, and the President's defense team as well. We believe that members of the Senate should hear those arguments and then proceed to consider any additional evidence. What kind of evidence may be relevant? Well, as Senator Schumer of New York mentioned just a few minutes ago, it seems that every day there unfolds another chapter in this story. Every day we learn of the efforts of the President's self-described personal attorney, Rudolph Giuliani, to appeal directly to the leadership of Ukraine to initiate a political investigation of the Biden family, to serve President Trump's political interest in the 2020 presidential campaign. We've also heard repeatedly on the floor here that there have been no allegations of anything that was illegal or criminal on the part of the president. The standard in the Constitution for impeachment does not require the violation of a federal crime. Our Constitution was written before any statutes creating federal crimes had been created. Rather, the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors was used as a standard to be imposed on the president. But we've just received information in the last 24 hours from the General Accounting Office, which does raise very serious concern about illegality of the president's action in withholding the funds appropriated by Congress to support the Ukrainian defense efforts against the invasion of Russian troops by Vladimir Putin in their country. As a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, the ranking member of the Defense Subcommittee, I can recall when we, on a bipartisan basis, decided to provide additional assistance to Ukraine in the form of hundreds of millions of U.S. tax dollars so that they could defend themselves against the invasion of Vladimir Putin. That money was appropriated, and we believed would be sent in a timely way to the Ukrainians to defend their own country. Little did we know that that money would become part of the bargaining between President Trump and the President of Ukraine as to this political investigation. It turns out that money was withheld until the very last moment. The fact is, I was offering an amendment in the Senate Appropriations Committee, and I was told that the night before, late the night before, the president finally released the funds. Questions were raised by Senator Van Hollen to the General Accounting Office, the Government Accountability Office, as to whether or not that was legal or illegal for the administration to withhold those funds. We've now received the statement from the General Accounting Office. They have held that the president's withholding of funds to Ukraine violated federal law. The Government Accountability Office has a sterling reputation as a nonpartisan watchdog of taxpayers' dollars. GAO's legal opinion today concludes that President Trump and his administration violated the law by putting a hold on military aid to Ukraine while that country was trying to defend itself against an invasion ordered by Vladimir Putin. This is an important ruling that deserves a thorough hearing in the impeachment trial. It should be part of the evidence of wrongdoing by the president, especially as it relates to the alleged charges of abuse of power. I also hope this ruling will convince the administration to speed the additional delivery of $250 million in military aid, which the Congress has also sent to Ukraine. Finally, Madam President, I'm going to yield the floor because I know one of my colleagues is coming to speak. In just a few hours, this chamber will be transformed. As we noted yesterday, at about 5:38 p.m., when the clerk of the House arrived with the articles of impeachment, there was a change in the atmosphere and environment of this chamber, and I can sense it even today. We realize that we are only moments away from an historic meeting of this chamber on the issue of presidential impeachment. When we take that oath of office, each and every one of us, swearing impartial justice, we need to remember that not only is America watching, but history will hold us accountable. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
Madam President, soon the Senate will vote on the final passage of the new North American Free Trade Agreement. I'm going to make just a few remarks. I know Senator Toomey is here to make remarks. Later, he is going to offer, I believe, some procedural requests. The new NAFTA is a good deal for American workers because Democrats in this body, Democrats in the other body, stopped the Trump administration from going ahead with business as usual on trade enforcement. There's even been an effort by several members on the other side in the Senate to actually block enforcement dollars. With Chairman Grassley's help, we were able to prevent that. If you write a trade agreement with weak enforcement, particularly on labor and environmental issues, my view is you sell out American workers in key industries, whether it's automobiles, whether it's technology, whether it's manufacturing. You basically set up a race to the bottom on cheap wages and the treatment of labor. I particularly want to thank Senator Brown, my colleague from Ohio, who for decades has led the fight for tough trade enforcement. We spoke yesterday on the floor about our effort. We worked on this side of the aisle, but we reached out to a lot of senators on the other side of the aisle as well. And I want to just give an example of what the Brown-Wyden trade enforcement package does. In the past, it would take almost to eternity to bring a trade enforcement action. I spelled out yesterday, Madam President, how the Brown-Wyden enforcement package speeds up the timeline for tough trade enforcement by more than 300%. That, in my view, throws a real lifeline, an actual lifeline to communities that are worried about whether they're going to have an economic heartbeat in the days ahead. I also want to mention, and I'm then going to yield to my colleague, and we're going to use this time so that everybody gets a chance to make some remarks, is this is the first ever trade agreement in which the United States locks in strong rules on digital trade and technology. Back when the first NAFTA came about, you didn't have United States senators with smartphones in their pocket. You didn't have the internet as the shipping lane of the 21st century. So what we did in this part of the bill was really bipartisan. We protected intellectual property, we prohibited shakedowns of data belonging to innovative American companies, and I was especially involved in making sure that we drew on established U.S. law to defend the small technology entrepreneurs working to build successful companies in a field dominated by a small number of Goliaths. These rules on technology and trade ought to be the cornerstones of our trade policy in the years ahead, because those rules, the rules on technology, protect every single American industry. Healthcare, manufacturing, agriculture, you name it. It's how the United States also is going to fight back against authoritarian governments that use the internet as a tool to repress their own people, bully American businesses and workers, and meddle with the free speech rights of American citizens. So the bottom line here is, and my colleague who sits right behind me, Senator Brown, was so key to producing a bill that had the provisions, the prerequisite to getting a law, frankly, with tough trade law enforcement that brought literally dozens of members of both the Senate and the House over to support this. I want to thank him and wrap up by saying I'm not sure that he's with us today here in the Senate gallery, but Ambassador Bob Lighthizer deserves a special thanks today. He may be off around the world somewhere talking to additional trade ministers, looking for other opportunities to come up with tough, future-oriented trade agreements. Ambassador Lighthizer is the hardest working man in the trade agreement business. I want to thank him for all his work. I have a difference of opinion with my colleague from Pennsylvania on these issues. We may have some procedure, but I think you're going to see senators handle these issues over the next 20 minutes in a way that reflects the seriousness of this issue. And I would yield back, and I know the senator from Pennsylvania will speak next.
Madam President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to thank the ranking member of our committee for all of the work that he's put into this effort, even though I disagree in some important respects. One I want to talk about this morning is the process under which we are going to consider and probably pass this legislation. We are considering this legislation under Trade Promotion Authority. That refers to another bill, a law actually, that we passed some time ago that expedites the process, forbids senators from offering amendments, allows passage of the legislation to occur with a simple majority vote, 51 out of 100, instead of the usual 60-vote threshold. So that's what Trade Promotion Authority makes possible. It seems to me it's very, very important that any legislation we consider under Trade Promotion Authority be compliant with Trade Promotion Authority, because if it's not, if we allow extraneous provisions, for instance, then we're circumventing the normal legislative process, we're circumventing the 60-vote threshold, and we're abusing Trade Promotion Authority. And one of the reasons that's so important is this is a delegated authority. I remind my colleagues, trade policy is clearly and unambiguously assigned to Congress in the Constitution. It's our responsibility to manage trade. And legislation is obviously and undoubtedly exclusively granted to Congress in the Constitution. So our branch of government, has exclusive responsibility for trade and legislating. Well, what do we have here? We have a piece of legislation that deals with trade. So when we choose to delegate our responsibility to the executive branch, it's very, very important to me that we insist that that delegated authority be exercised properly and the legislation that follows from it complies with the law. Well, what I want to raise is a concern about one of several, but one in particular, one respect in which the legislation we're considering today does not, in fact, comply with the Trade Promotion Authority under which this legislation is being considered. And specifically, I'm going to zero in on a certain aspect of some of the spending that occurs in this bill. By way of background, I think it's important to note the Senate has never passed a spending bill with a simple majority vote. I don't think that's ever happened in modern times since we've established a 60-vote threshold anyway, on any piece of legislation. We don't do discretionary appropriations at a simple majority vote because it's been the collective will of this body for decades that that responsibility should occur at a 60-vote threshold and should be subject to amendments. Not only that, we've got discretionary spending in this bill, and this is the first time that any trade implementing legislation has ever spent money. Of the 17 trade bills that we have considered in recent decades under fast-tracked authority, none of them have ever contained any kind of appropriation, any kind of government spending. It's not that there's no spending necessary for the implementation of these other agreements. There was. But that spending always ran separately in a different bill, a different piece of legislation, a piece of legislation that was subject to amendment and a 60-vote threshold. Now, why is that? Well, that is in order to comply with the Trade Promotion Authority, in order to comply with the conditions of granting expedited process. So what Trade Promotion Authority says, among other things, is that any provision in this implementing legislation must be strictly necessary or appropriate for the implementation of the trade agreement. Well, spending is not strictly necessary for this purpose because it can occur in a separate bill, and that's the way it's always been done. If we allow this to proceed on this basis, exactly as is contemplated, we're really going to dramatically undermine the 60-vote threshold for spending. And there is spending in this bill. There's $843 million, almost $1 billion. And it gets worse. It gets worse, Madam President, because this spending has got an emergency spending designation. So it's not only that we're spending money in a way that's never been done before, it's not only that we're spending money in a trade implementing bill, which we've never done before, but now we've decided to call it emergency spending. Now, why is it that it gets an emergency spending designation? Why did someone bother to give this spending an emergency designation? Well, there's a simple reason. That's because under our budget rules, if you label spending emergency, then you don't have to offset that spending if you exceed our agreed upon statutory spending caps. Well, we're at the caps. And I gather that the folks who wrote this don't want to have to offset this new spending with a reduction anywhere else in the enormous budget of our federal government. So they've designated emergency spending. This is clearly an abuse of the use of an emergency designation. I mean, we designate emergency spending when we have to respond to a tornado or a flood or an outbreak of Ebola. These sorts of things, unpredictable, sudden, devastating, those are actual emergencies. That's what that provision is there for. But here, we're using it for things like doubling the staffing salary budget for the U.S. Trade Office. That's not an emergency. It's not even close. So I'm going to offer a point of order. It's very, very simple. It's very, very narrow. It's a very, very small thing. What I'm going to do is raise a point of order against the emergency designation of one of the spending lines in this appropriation. I could do it for all of them. I could raise an issue about the fact that they're spending in the first place. I'm not doing that. I'm taking a very, very modest and narrow approach. And I'm suggesting that we raise a point of order against the emergency designation, against a $50 million of the hundreds of millions of dollars altogether. That clearly is not an emergency, and clearly, in my view, is inconsistent with the Trade Promotion Authority. What are the consequences if my budget point of order were to succeed? First of all, not a dime of spending is reduced. This is not an attempt to cut spending. Eliminating an emergency designation does not cut any spending in this bill. What it would mean is that Congress would have to the end of the year to find an offset of this $50 million, which, by the way, is about 1/1000th of 1 penny for every dollar the federal government spends. It's a tiny, tiny amount of money. It means the bill will still pass because there's more than 60 votes for this bill, easily. And then it'll go to the House where it will pass because it already has passed. So the point isn't to save money, per se. That's too small to matter in that regard, really. The point is, are we willing to enforce our own law that governs the proceedings of this body? Now, I think one of my colleagues is likely to respond by offering a point of order or a provision that will preclude the possibility of my offering this point of order. Not only that, I think it's going to preclude the possibility of any senator offering any budgetary point of order, which is a way of saying it will be forbidden to enforce compliance with TPA's budgetary rules in this legislation. And to my colleague, I think that's a very, very bad idea. To suggest that we're going to have this bill that is not compliant with Trade Promotion Authority, and we're going to preclude the possibility of raising a point of order about that noncompliance, I think would be a big mistake. So soon, I'll have the exact language that we'll be using for this purpose, and we will we'll have this discussion, and then we'll have a vote on whether or not to preclude the possibility of enforcing our budget rules with respect to this implementing legislation. And
Madam President,
Senator from Iowa.
this is a very serious claim being made by Senator Toomey. I don't take this lightly because the privilege afforded by the Trade Promotion Authority is a very important matter. The appropriations language that Senator Toomey takes issue with is indeed Trade Promotion Authority compliant. The appropriations ensures that the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement commitments are fulfilled and enforceable by providing adequate resources to do so. The commitments cover bipartisan priorities, including monitoring and enforcement and recapitalization of the North American Development Bank. If funds were only authorized, as Senator Toomey has suggested, there'd be no guarantee that we'd be able to fulfill the commitments made in the USMCA, and the credibility of our good faith negotiations with Mexico and Canada is the presumption that we will carry out this agreement and carry it out year after year after year. Besides, historically, all trade bills result in changes to federal spending and revenue. This bill has the benefit of reducing the deficit, even with the funds discussed by Senator Toomey. Striking the emergency designation could lead to a sequestration of discretionary funding, as regular appropriations for fiscal years 2020 have already been enacted. The emergency designation is, in this precise context, and a very precise context, considered strictly necessary or appropriate under Section 103 of the Trade Promotion Authority 2015. Here is the oddity of the senator's argument. If Senator Toomey is suggesting funds be authorized, I think he inherently agrees that enforcement funding is either strictly necessary or appropriate to implement the USMCA. This is a very important clarification to make. Trade promotion language is, quote, strictly necessary or appropriate, end of quote. It's for Congress, then, to decide what is strictly necessary or appropriate. The Finance Committee, with jurisdiction over the entire bill, the Budget and the Appropriations Committees, with jurisdiction over the language at issue, voted overwhelmingly to support the bill. It's important to note that the final appropriation was significantly reduced in consideration of concerns about spending, including my own concerns. Finally, I'd also like to emphasize that this was a negotiated outcome which was necessary to achieve the broad bipartisan support that this bill is going to get, and particularly to get it initiated through the House of Representatives. I'm satisfied with the final outcome, so I'll make a motion to waive the point of order if it's made, and I would urge my colleagues to support waiving the point of order and to vote yes for the USMCA so we can deliver a victory for the American people.
Madam President,
Senator from Oregon.
I would ask unanimous consent to speak to 1 minute, and then Senator Toomey would proceed with the procedural question at hand.
Without objection.
Madam President, first I want to make sure that we can enter into the record the thanks that is deserved to the bipartisan team here in the Senate that has made this day possible. And second, one substantive point, because I associate myself with the remarks of Chairman Grassley. I think we need to understand that what the Toomey procedural issue is all about is it's really a Trojan horse for rolling back an aggressive effort to enforce rights that workers care about and we all care about with respect to our land, air, and water. I know the senator from Pennsylvania disagrees with it. I just wanted to make that point. The chairman is right with respect to the procedure. I just wanted people to understand what the substantive issue is. And this is just a policy disagreement, and that's what the Senate's all about. I yield.
Madam President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
2 quick points, and I'll get to the point of order. First of all, I disagree with the chairman. I do think that the spending in this bill is neither strictly necessary nor appropriate, but that's not what this point of order is about. If my point of order is sustained and the motion that is going to be made by the chairman were to be rejected, not a penny is reduced in spending of this bill, which is why I couldn't disagree more with my colleague from Oregon to suggest it's a Trojan horse for something. It doesn't cut spending by a dime from this bill. It simply means that by the end of the fiscal year, Congress will have to find an offset for this very, very modest amount of money. It's an attempt to try to enforce some kind of compliance. And so, Madam President, pursuant to Section 314E of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, I raise a point of order against the emergency designation on page 233, lines 4 through 8 of H.R. 5430.
I object, and
Senator from Iowa.
pursuant to Section 904 of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 and the waiver provisions of applicable budget resolutions, I move to waive all applicable sections of that act and applicable budget resolution for purposes of H.R. 5430, and I ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The nays and yeas are ordered.
Madam President.
Senator from Kansas.
Madam President, thank you. I would ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 474 submitted earlier today.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 474 to authorize representation by the Senate Legal Counsel in the case of Martin F. McMahon versus Senator Ted Cruz et al.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
Madam President, I then ask for unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President.
Senator from Kansas.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate Resolution 3201 introduced earlier today.
The clerk will report.
S3201, a bill to extend the temporary scheduling order for fentanyl-related substances and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
Then I would ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Madam President.
Senator from Kansas.
I finally ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Veterans Affairs be discharged from further consideration of S3084 and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
S3084, a bill to amend Title 38 United States Code to modify the limitation on pay for certain high-level employees and officers of the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
Then, Madam President, I would
It
ask...
is discharged and Senate will proceed.
Thank you. I then would ask, Madam President, that unanimous consent be granted, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
And finally, Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Judiciary be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 886 and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 886, an act to direct the Attorney General to establish and carry out a veteran treatment court program.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the committee is discharged. We will proceed to the measure.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask now unanimous consent that the McSally amendment at the desk be agreed to, and that the bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection. All time has expired. Questions on the measure to waive. The yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Brown, Coons, Durbin, Ernst, Grassley, Hyde-Smith, Jones, Moran, Murray, Rounds, Shaheen, Smith, Thune, Udall, and Wyden. Mr. Toomey voted in the negative. Mr. Blunt, aye. That's Mr. Sass, no. Is Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. No, it's not. Sure. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. I did not. Let's have her look at me so that she gets it. Mrs. Loeffler, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Yes, sir. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Casey, aye.
Except until all these juniors decide if they're going to go or not. Like it doesn't. What are they asking?
Mr. Reed, Mr. Reed, no. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Gardner,
I think we played y'all at home.
no. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Enzi,
My daughter loves Joe Burrow.
no.
If he proposed, she would say yes.
Mr. Reed,
Ms. Salazar, the correct answer is
aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Tillis, no.
Are you a Mississippi?
Mr. Peters,
Aye.
aye. Mr. Wicker,
Person likes to know what
aye.
that's a good thing. The woman who's my
Mr. Lee,
Louisiana mother.
no. Ms. McSally, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Cotton,
Which, again, the Texans are trying to kind of.
Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Romney, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Lankford, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mr. Daines. Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Mr. Perdue. No. Ms. Hassan. Aye. Mr. Braun. No. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Mr. Kennedy. No. Mr. Risch. Aye. Mr. Young. No. Mr. Barrasso. No. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mrs. Fisher, no. Oh, Ms. Harris, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber that wish to vote or wish to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 78, the nays are 21. 3/5 of senators duly chosen and sworn have voted in the affirmative. The motion is agreed to, and the point of order fails. The clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
Calendar number 406, H.R. 5430, an act to implement the agreement between the United States of America, the United Mexican States, and Canada, attached as an annex to the protocol replacing the North American Free Trade Agreement.
The Senate will be in order.
Mr. President,
The senator from Iowa.
I ask unanimous consent for 30 seconds for me and 1 minute for Senator Wyden for closing remarks.
Without objection.
The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement is a major achievement for President Trump and a very big bipartisan win for the American people. We should all take care, Republican or Democrat, that this is good. I look forward to signing this bill and sending it to the President's desk. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Oregon.
When the Trump administration unveiled their original version of this proposal, it was stunning to see how weak it was in terms of trade enforcement. When you write a proposal with weak trade enforcement, particularly on labor and environmental issues, you sell out American workers and you launch a corporate race to the bottom of cheap wages and the treatment of labor. Senator Brown and I decided that was unacceptable, and we were going to create a trade enforcement regime with real teeth. We worked with senators here, we worked with senators on the other side of the aisle and in the other body. To give you an example of what this means with respect to enforcing trade law, we sped up the timeline by more than 300%. Second point, just very quickly, what this proposal does is it brings technology and trade policy into the 21st century. When the last North American Free Trade Agreement was considered, nobody had a smartphone. So what we did is we protected intellectual property, we prohibited shakedowns of data belonging to innovative companies, and on something I care deeply about, we drew on established U.S. law to defend small tech entrepreneurs working to build successful companies in a field dominated by Goliaths. I urge my colleagues to support this proposal and once again thank Bob Lighthizer, the hardest working man in the trade agreement business. I urge a yes vote.
The question is on the passage of the bill. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal.
It's for everything, but you can follow along. It has separate numbering for
Mr. Blunt.
Yes, sir. You can call him the senator from Iowa or the president pro tempore. Is this your working job?
Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman.
They do. Easier to name the committees that don't have your water test. I got a VAL, pretty sure here.
Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown.
Non-campus fire safety.
Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell.
I know we've done some weird stuff with
Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Get out. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo.
All right, I'll be on the back side. I'm going to drop this stuff off.
Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst.
people. Well, one of them is my uncle. I don't know how other people, they have senators have tickets.
And
I have one ticket and I get
Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Loeffler.
Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Bennett, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Daines, Durbin, Enzi, Ernst, Feinstein, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Langford, Leahy, Manchin, McSally, Menendez, Moran, Murphy, Murray, Hall, Perdue, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Romney, Rosen, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Warner, Warren, Wicker, Wyden, Young. Ms. Smith? Aye. Mr. Peters? Aye. Mr. Udall? Aye. Mrs. Loeffler? Aye. Mr. Rubio? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Gillibrand, Harris, Reed, Schumer, Toomey, Whitehouse. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Jones. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Jones, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Booker, no.
The yeas are 89, the nays are 10. The bill is passed.
Mr. President.
The Senate will be in order. The Senate will
not
be
in
in order.
order.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, for the information of senators, under the previous order, at 12 noon, the Senate will receive the managers of the House of Representatives to exhibit the articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
The hour of 12 noon having arrived and a quorum being present, the Sergeant-at-Arms will present the managers on the part of the House of Representatives.
Mr. President and members of the Senate, I announce the presence of the managers on the part of the House of Representatives to conduct proceedings on behalf of the House concerning the impeachment of Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
On the part of the House will be received and escorted to the well of the Senate. The Sergeant-at-Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent on pain of imprisonment while the House of Representatives is exhibiting to the Senate of the United States articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
The managers on the part of the House will now proceed.
Mr. President, the managers on the part of the House of Representatives are present and ready to present the articles of impeachment which have been preferred by the House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. The House adopted the following resolution, which, with the permission of the Senate, I will read. House Resolution 798, appointing and authorizing managers for the impeachment trial of Donald John Trump, President of the United States. Resolved that Mr. Schiff, Mr. Nadler, Ms. Lofgren, Mr. Jeffries, Ms. Demings, Mr. Crow, and Ms. Garcia of Texas are appointed managers to conduct the impeachment trial against Donald John Trump, President of the United States, that a message be sent to the Senate to inform the Senate of these appointments, and that the managers so appointed may, in connection with the preparation and conduct of the trial, exhibit articles of impeachment to the Senate and take all other actions necessary, which may include the following: employing legal, clerical, and other necessary assistance, and incurring such other expenses as may be necessary to be paid from amounts available to the Committee on the Judiciary under applicable expense resolutions or from the applicable account of the House of Representatives. Number two, sending for persons and papers and filing with the Secretary of the Senate on the part of the House of Representatives any pleadings in conjunction with or subsequent to the exhibition of the articles of impeachment that the managers may consider necessary. With the permission of the Senate, I will now read the articles of impeachment, House Resolution 755. House Resolution 755, impeaching Donald John Trump, President of the United States, for high crimes and misdemeanors. Resolved that Donald J. Trump, President of the United States, is impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors, and that the following articles of impeachment be exhibited to the United States Senate. Articles of impeachment exhibited by the House of Representatives of the United States of America in the name of itself and of the people of the United States of America against Donald John Trump, President of the United States of America, in maintenance and support of its impeachment against him for high crimes and misdemeanors. Article 1, abuse of power. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of the President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and to the best of his ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in that, using the powers of his high office, President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. He did so through a scheme or course of conduct that included soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his reelection, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. President Trump also sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on its public announcement of the investigations. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct for corrupt purposes in pursuit of personal political benefit. In so doing, President Trump used the powers of the presidency in a manner that compromised the national security of the United States and undermined the integrity of the United States democratic process. He thus ignored and injured the interests of the nation. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct through the following means. Number one, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into A, political opponent, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., and B, a discredited theory promoted by Russia, alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 United States presidential election. Number two, with the same corrupt motives, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, conditioned two official acts on the public announcement that he had requested. A, the release of $91 million of United States taxpayer funds that Congress had appropriated on a bipartisan basis for the purpose of providing vital military and security assistance to Ukraine to oppose Russian aggression, and which President Trump had ordered suspended. And B, a head of state meeting at the White House, which the President of Ukraine sought to demonstrate continued United States support for the government of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. Number three, faced with the public revelation of his actions, President Trump ultimately released the military and security assistance to the government of Ukraine, but has persisted in openly and corruptly urging and soliciting Ukraine to undertake investigations for his personal political benefit. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections. In all of this, President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring and injuring national security and other vital national interests to obtain an improper personal political benefit. He has also betrayed the nation by abusing his high office to enlist a foreign power in corrupting democratic elections. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. Article 2, obstruction of Congress. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and to the best of his ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the power of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution, in that the House of Representatives has engaged in an impeachment inquiry focused on President Trump's corrupt solicitation of the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committees undertaking the investigation served subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to exercise the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. Number one, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. Number two, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, the Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. Directing current and former, number three, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael Mick Mulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Preston Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vaught, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Breckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of the impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. Mr. President, that completes the exhibition of the articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. The managers request that the Senate take order for the trial. The managers now request leave to withdraw.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. The Senate will duly notify the House of Representatives when it is ready to proceed to trial.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
for the information of senators pursuant to yesterday's order, at 2 o'clock today, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of the articles of impeachment. The Chief Justice of the United States will preside over the trial as required in Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the United States Constitution. Also, under the previous order, the presiding officer has been authorized to appoint a committee of 4 senators, 2 upon the recommendation of the Majority Leader and 2 upon the recommendation of the Democratic Leader, to escort the Chief Justice into the Senate chamber. I ask that the presiding officer do so now.
The Chair, pursuant to Order January 15, 2020, on behalf of the Majority Leader and the Democratic Leader, appoints Mr. Blunt of Missouri, Mr. Leahy of Vermont, Mr. Graham of South Carolina, and Mrs. Feinstein of California to escort the Chief Justice of the United States into the Senate chamber.
So for the further information of senators, there will be a live quorum call prior to the arrival of the Chief Justice at 2 p.m. today. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Without objection, the Senate stands in recess subject to the call of the chair.